Welcome to our next session. I think probably some people are still enjoying lunch, and it was a very good lunch, so I can completely understand that. So the next session is What's New in SSC Treatments? I'm Sue Farrington, and I'll be moderating this session. And I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce our three participants. Michael Oeschger, who's been living with systemic sclerosis for 20 years. As you probably have heard in previous sessions, he's the chair of the German Scleroderma Association and chair of the German Scleroderma Foundation. Dr. Shervin Usasi, Director of Rheumatology at the UT Health Euston, where he co-directs the UT Health Scleroderma Program, which houses one of the largest specialized systemic sclerosis programs in the US. And Brian Lee, Senior Director of Immunology, Cardiovascular and Autoimmune Cell Therapy, part of the patient advocacy team within Global Patient Outreach at Bristol Myers Squibb, based in Princeton, New Jersey. I just want to make a note. References to specific clinical trials, pharmaceutical companies, and branded drugs will not be made during the session. We are brand neutral, and that's either by speakers or any members of the audience. So in this session today, we're going to be looking at what's emerging in SSC in terms of new treatments. And I know that you had a really, really good session earlier on looking at stem cell and CAR T-cell therapy. So what we want to do now is kind of move beyond the science to look at the environment that this is sitting in. And we'll be covering topics from unmet needs to innovation to patient involvement and access. And we'll be asking how innovation may transform current treatment strategies and whether they offer new hope for improved outcomes and personalized care. So I want to start by looking at the need for new therapeutic approaches. And I'd like to ask Michael, to start with Michael, and saying, from your lived experience, where do you feel existing therapies fall short? And what would meaningful innovation look like for patients?
Well, thank you for that question. So first I have to say that you heard I have been living with scleroderma for 20 years now. And 20 years ago, the situation was very different from now. There were less treatment options, and I have to say that the improvement over the last 20 years is a good thing. So we are happy to have the treatments that there are. But nonetheless, most of the treatments, not to say all of them, they focus on managing individual symptoms rather than changing the overall course of the disease and the underlying process. So, for example, many patients have therapy for lung fibrosis, they have therapy for GI involvement, they have therapy for vasculopathy, or all three of them. But still the underlying process of the disease is proceeding in parallel. Slowed down by immunos, but still going on and progressing. And the other thing is that the current therapies, when they are applied, mostly there is a certain damage done. This is, of course, a reason is the long path to diagnosis. But on the other hand, health insurances won't pay, for example, for a lung treatment if the lung fibrosis is not proved. So it has to be visible first, so there has to be a certain damage, and then you get the treatment. So for patients, a meaningful innovation would therefore mean therapies that truly modify the course of the disease, the underlying reason, and ideally slowing or stopping progression before the damage is done, preventing irreversible organ damages. So from the patient perspective, innovation is not only about mechanisms, but about therapies that change the long-term outlook of the disease.
Brian, I'd like to come to you next, because as we've just heard from Michael, kind of current therapies often feel quite limited or symptomatic. So in your work, do you see the need for new classes of compounds or even a fundamental paradigm shift in how we treat SSC?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. And I think Michael provided some fantastic context. I hope many of you were able to join his session earlier today where he talked about some of the new emerging therapies such as cell therapies. I think from an industry perspective, we're starting to see a lot of new therapies being researched and hopefully potentially being approved in the next few years or so that will really address the underlying cause of many of these autoimmune conditions, many of these B-cell mediated autoimmune conditions. So as Michael shared, many of the current therapies slow disease progression or maybe just suppress the immune system. I think we're on the precipice and the verge of looking at new research where we can potentially reset the immune system. Of course, a lot of this research is new. A lot of trials from a lot of companies are in phase 1. Some are moving into phase 3 trials soon as well. But it's very exciting because we are, as an industry, looking at therapies that could potentially lead to treatment-free remission by resetting the immune system. But again, early, we've only seen maybe data and information to show that some patients who have received these investigational therapies have been off of other treatments, other immunosuppressants for 1 or 2 years or so. So we're waiting to see, and we're hopeful that some of these treatments will hopefully lead to treatment-free remission for as long as possible. We've seen in other therapeutic areas like hematology and oncology that was shared in a previous session where patients remain cancer-free for 10 or 20 years through a similar mechanism, through the CAR-T construct, the cell therapy construct. Again, hopeful, but we don't have the data yet in the autoimmune condition. So I think overall hopeful, waiting on the data, waiting on the research, but in the next few to several years, we're starting to see a lot of companies, a lot of studies in the autoimmune conditions like systemic sclerosis, lupus, myositis, and other conditions as well.
Thank you. And Shervin, from your perspective as a rheumatologist, do you think there's a need to have this fundamental paradigm shift in the way we treat SSC?
I agree with Michael, first of all, that we have come a long way. I remember the day where we didn't have even mycophenolate. When I was a fellow, I would say half of my patients in the waiting room were sitting in a wheelchair. This is not happening now. So we have come a long way. I remember that we couldn't even convince one pharmaceutical company to do a clinical trial in systemic sclerosis. They would say, it's a rare disease, we don't understand it, you don't understand it. Why would I do a clinical trial in systemic sclerosis? So this has changed. There is a lot of research, good research about molecular profiling, then also a lot of interest on the side of pharma to try new drugs in systemic sclerosis. I think where we are lacking is, at this point, what we are doing is one size fits all. We give everybody mycophenolate to start with, and then if that doesn't work, we look for other options. We need to be smarter in molecular profiling the patients. I don't think this disease is triggered by the same pathway in everybody. So ideally, we would like to personalize our treatment approach. I don't think that's a pie in the sky. I think that is doable with all this modern technology that we have. Also, you can add machine learning to it. And obviously, in terms of treatments, we want treatments that are not a hammer, but a scalpel that take out the pathway that is dysregulated. And I believe that pathway is not necessarily the same in everybody. And also, we want that treatment to be well tolerated.
Thank you. So we've clearly heard that there's a need for better options and ideally a far more personalised approach, given that scleroderma affects many different people in different ways. Brian, these kind of cell therapies, they offer enormous hope, and that's the kind of message that we're hearing from within the community. But there are significant challenges around safety, access and reimbursement. What role do they play in your pipeline, and how do you plan to bring them into real-world practice for scleroderma patients?
So, Sue, it's a fantastic question. I think there's no doubt that we are waiting for more information from a safety perspective. I think we've seen some fantastic data from an initial efficacy perspective, but we are waiting to better understand long-term efficacy, durability as well. And then when we talk about access, this is actually a very complicated topic because these drugs that we're looking at for cell therapy are personalized. We are creating medicine based on each individual's cells. So this is drug that is personalized for each individual. So the manufacturing process is just incredibly complex as well as expensive. And I think when we talk about access, it's not just the price. We have to layer on the other challenges before a patient can obtain the medicine, and that is that the patient needs to go to an accredited treatment center that's not available in every city or every country. They need to stay there for a couple weeks for monitoring. They undergo a fairly in-depth process. They need to have caregiver support. They need to be able to take time off of work for multiple weeks. So very, very complex process. From the industry perspective, many companies are helping the patients participate in clinical trials by paying, reimbursing the patients to go to different cities for their stay, for their caregivers to come with them to participate in clinical trials. I think when these therapies will inevitably hit the market, the company's industry needs to figure out how we can also support patients to come and receive the product, ensure that they can reach the centers, that there are policies in place from a healthcare policy standpoint or a country policy standpoint so that they can take time off from work, that their caregivers can come, that if they have kids or pets, that coverage is in place as well. So it's really an entire social support system where industry has to work with the patient, the caregiver, payers, government to ensure that there's really surround sound support so that patients can actually obtain the medicine. So when we talk about access, it's not just price, it's really the entire support system for the patient to be able to get it. And those are the things that I think we're working on with all of our stakeholders, and we hope to work on over the next few years before therapies are on the market. So it's complex, there's a lot of work to be done, but we are looking at this holistically.
So Shervin, I know this is all in its infancy, but kind of where we currently stand clinically, where do you see these therapies fitting within SSC treatment strategies, and which patient profiles stand to benefit most?
So I agree that at this point the data are promising, but we need additional studies to ensure that this treatment is safe, but also it leads to long-term efficacy. So at this point, it remains an experimental drug. So because it's an experimental treatment, it should be given to patients who don't respond to the currently available treatment, at least one or two treatments. We come from a field that had the luxury that we know, for example, immunoablation followed by autologous stem cell transplantation or myeloablation followed by autologous stem cell transplantation works in systemic sclerosis. No other field has 3 randomized controlled trials to show that that works. Our field has that, but it's hardly used. If you ask me how often I use it most probably 1 to 2 times per year. And it hasn't been, we haven't been able to scale it, to give it to a broad population of patients. Some of it is because it has a high short-term mortality, around 10%. Some of it is purely operational because rheumatologists don't give that treatment. It would require collaboration between a cell therapist and rheumatologist. So we have to be creative. If, for example, CAR-based treatments are working to ensure that that operational aspect becomes simpler. So when I was talking about personalized medicine, I think CAR-Ts are personalized because they take your own blood and put the card on it, but it's not personalized in terms of target. It's CD19. So the question is whether CD19 will be sufficient for everybody. That needs to be studied. We don't know until we do the studies. So in terms of operational, facilitating the operational difficulties, if we can make it as on outpatient basis, if we can teach rheumatologists, for example, to provide that treatment, or we had off-shelf options, so CAR-Ts, some of them are off-shelf, basically they don't take your own blood, or CAR-NKs, some of them, they take your own blood and then modify it and give it back to you. That is obviously a little bit more difficult. All that needs to be studied. We don't know for sure whether we can simplify it. We obviously love to simplify it, but if we simplify it and it's not effective, there's no point of doing it. So all that needs to be studied, but I think we should already think about those things now, because we had myeloablation followed by autologous stem transplantation. I remember 10 years ago, we thought we got it. We cured the disease. That was not the case because it was so difficult to operationalize it.
Yeah, and that is one of the challenges, isn't it? Alongside the kind of science progresses, but there are other factors within the system that are currently potential barriers that we need to be looking at now. We've talked about personalization, and we know that SSC is an incredibly diverse disease. Biomarkers, autoantibodies, clinical subtypes and risk profiles all influence both progression and treatment response. So Michael, I want to come to you and ask, how important do you think personalized care from a patient point of view is, given how variable the disease can be? Is this a reality, or is it a kind of pipe dream?
Well, it seems that it is becoming slowly a reality. My opinion is that personalized treatment is very important, especially in scleroderma, because patients may have the same diagnosis, but they are not developing the same symptoms, and if they do develop the same symptoms, not in the same degree. And also the perception is different, the pain level can be different, and so on. Through my work in our association, I know many people with scleroderma now. I can say that I know more people with scleroderma than others, meanwhile, and many of them are friends, and I haven't met two of them that are exactly the same. Yeah? Everyone is individual. They have everyone has bent fingers, for example, but they look different still. They are some of them are fixed, unfortunately, some of them are not, and so there's so many different aspects. So personalized care is the thing we want to be, we want to go. And it means also identifying patients with same symptoms, but for example, higher risk levels. So maybe patients with higher risk levels have to be treated earlier or harder, let's put it like that. And so intervening before the irreversible damage is done, I said that before, is very important. And I think we can reach that better with personalized medicine than as we do now, just give everyone the same drug for the same reason. And another important aspect out of a patient perspective are side effects. So we also need to think about avoid unnecessary treatments. So the other side of the medal. So ultimately, personalized care should be a shift away from trial and error medicine to a more precise and preventive care.
Yeah, thank you. That leads me on to the next question for Shervin. Having heard what you've heard from Michael, how do you think we integrate risk profiles, autoantibodies, and clinical subtypes into personalised therapy development? And I want to ask then the same question to Brian.
I think actually we are already in specialized scleroderma center to some extent personalizing the treatment based on autoantibodies, based on the prior course of disease, based on the preferences of the patient. So that's, I would actually advocate if, for example, you are considering cell therapies or other more involved therapies, try to be seen by a scleroderma specialist, because that scleroderma specialist has seen a lot of scleroderma patients and has picked up a mental pattern of progression, has a gestalt for how to treat this disease, which is extremely heterogeneous. Michael, you are right. There are no, so similar to Michael, knows a lot of scleroderma patients. I almost exclusively treat scleroderma, right? So I have seen hundreds of patients with scleroderma. So there's no two patients alike. So it does require experience, also a gestalt of how to personalize the treatment. But having said that, we are just in the beginning. So I would advocate, and you guys can help me do that, to advocate for pharma companies to work with us to release their molecular data so that we can decide who is a progressor, as you mentioned, who is at risk for progression, and who is a responder. So that ultimately that requires, because the best data for developing biomarkers is actually the data from pharmaceutical companies, from the clinical trials, because the treatments are very, very regimented there. So it requires an academia-industry partnership with involvement of patients to develop personalized medicine.
Okay, Brian, so you've heard the challenge. Yeah. What do you think industry can do to improve the molecular data, working in a kind of multi-stakeholder group to do that?
Fantastic question, and completely agree with everything both Michael and Dr. Asasi has mentioned so far. When we talk about things like autoantibodies, risk profiles, from a drug development perspective, we're looking at all these factors to really learn more about disease progression. And from the disease progression, we can better learn whether or not this medicine works in this type of disease that maybe progresses faster based on different autoantibodies and different factors. So for drug development, we're looking at a couple of things. How do we ensure that we have the highest scientific and regulatory success? And so we try to narrow the patient population that we're studying with the risk factors so that we can ensure, hopefully, success of a medicine. And as those medicines are hopefully approved, we start to broaden out that research through different avenues like investigator-sponsored studies and investigator-sponsored research, and maybe additional studies with larger groups, larger cohorts of different types of patients that have different factors. And so this is typically how we approach research. And other conditions, we've seen opportunities where companies will work together in consortiums and share biomarker information, data information. So there are quite a few consortiums and alliances out there where we can do this. And I think Dr. Asasi is definitely suggesting a fantastic idea where we can come together as industry and work together, share the raw data with each other as well as with academia to better understand the disease. Because as we all know, the more we work together, the more information and the better research is, and the more it's better for the patients.
So I'm going to say watch this space. 2028, Florence, we will hear about this groundbreaking partnership between industry, academia, and patient community. No pressure, Brian. So personalization isn't just about biology. It's about listening to people living with the disease. And this is a constant theme that comes up time and time again. And this directly leads into the next theme that I want us to explore. And I would suggest that in a complex disease like systemic sclerosis, patient involvement is essential. But of course, I would say that. From shaping trial design to defining meaningful outcomes, the patient voice can help ensure that innovations align with real needs and lived experience. Brian, I want to ask you, how do you involve patients early in the study design or development phases?
Yeah, fantastic question. I think, I've been in patient advocacy for almost 13 years now. During that time, I've seen companies take a much better approach to involving patients within drug development. I think during one of the beginning sessions of this patient conference, we heard another presenter speak on behalf of her company about involving the patients. We certainly do something very similar. So we have a structured program at our company where we systematically include the patient voice within drug development. In fact, it is required for all of our phase 3 registrational programs to have patient or patient community review our protocols before internal sign-off. What I do at my company is really ensure that the patient voice is included within drug development. So what I tell my colleagues is, every time that you ask a prescriber their advice, their thoughts on our program, I say, is it also appropriate to ask a patient or someone from the patient community? So we don't require it, we don't mandate it, because sometimes we're looking at something that's very, very clinical, like a mechanism of action or something very specific. But I encourage my colleagues to say, is it the right time? Should we be asking the patient community? And of course, there are some nuances. I mean, we try to include the patient as early as possible, but there are some challenges. For example, if you're in a phase 1 study, maybe it'll take 8 years. Maybe you don't know the indication yet, because some of our oncology drugs or even some of our autoimmune therapies, we're looking at maybe 4 or 5 different potential diseases to study in, and we're waiting to see safety signals and then efficacy in your phase 2 maybe. So certainly there are some nuances, and for everyone's understanding, phase 1 trials in oncology, I think, have a 95% chance of failure. So you're talking about 5% chance of success. Cardiovascular, it's like a 25% chance of success. So you start to go up in different therapeutic areas, different conditions, but it's a huge, huge chance of success. So you have to leverage resources. Do we get patient input, provider input, how many in a phase 1 where there's a high chance of failure, and what questions? So we have to be very strategic about it. We do have structures in place, but I think overall we're trending in the right direction. We could always use much more patient input throughout our development programs, but we have to be strategic about when we do it, what are the questions we're asking. Patient burden, absolutely. Study design, absolutely. Some of those are just so important.
I would suggest to you that even if you think there's going to be failures along the line, to me that's not a reason not to involve patients. So it does seem that you are a champion for patient involvement, but actually maybe there's more that needs to be done for the structures. You mentioned you have got structures. So what structures does your company have in place to kind of systematically integrate the patient voice into R&D processes?
Yep, so for our structures, again, required for phase 3. So all our phase 3 trials have already had patient input prior to starting the phase 3 trial. We're moving earlier, so some of our priority trials, as we call it, so some of our better resource trials in phase 2, we get patient input. Phase 1, it really depends on the program, how much staffing we have, if we have a history of already working with the patient organizations in the therapeutic area. So obviously we have history in autoimmune conditions and oncology, hematology. But if we were to go into a completely new therapeutic area, new disease in a phase 1, then we have to figure out how much resources we have, which organizations to engage. Can we engage with the patient community for potentially 8 years before potential approval?
Okay.
Maybe we'll fail in between that time. So
I'm going to pass the question now to Michael and say to Michael, what does meaningful patient involvement mean to you?
Well, it means to me, for example, that what we are doing right at the moment. I want to mention this Congress. This Congress is a unique event where a medical Congress and a patient Congress happen parallel together. You won't see that anywhere else. So you just see that in scleroderma. So this is where patient involvement starts. So under the shelter of patient organizations, patients should gather and be informed. It should start with transparency. What is happening in research? Which therapy is a good option for you? And so exactly what we are doing. So this is the beginning of a meaningful patient involvement, because good informed patients tend to be more willing to participate in a trial then. To give you some numbers, in Germany we have a patient register for scleroderma patients, and I think there's about 11,000 patients registered who have given their blood samples and filled some surveys and stuff. Calculating from the prevalence in Germany, there may be around 20 or 25,000 scleroderma patients, and we have 1,300 members, so this is not even 10%. So that means that the majority of scleroderma patients are running around out there, not involved in our information session. And that leads me to the thought that patients should be involved very early in research, even earlier than now. They should be involved when the trials are designed already. So not in phase 3, but before, because patients can contribute insights that are difficult to be seen from a purely medical perspective, such as the burden of the disease. What does it mean in daily life? What are my problems? What kind of a treatment do I need? And what kind of effects do I need the treatment to create for me? So it is not just laboratory, it is not just blood work, it's not just medical statistics, it's also the value that a treatment gives to a patient, and this should influence already very early in the trial design. So this leads to a better understanding from the patient's side, and when patients understand better, they are more willing to participate. And so research can be more effective and ultimately more impactful on patients' lives. And also, at the end of the chain, when you want your new medicine to be licensed, to be granted, you need to prove that there is a value to the patient, not only per laboratory, but also from the PROs. So, and you can reach that in a much better way when you involve patients the earliest you can.
Shervin, you're both a clinician, but you also do a lot of research. What's your perspective on involving patients in research?
I think it's very helpful. I can actually tell you which paper I have written based on which patient's question. So often, and that's the beauty of being a physician scientist, and I will never stop seeing patients, because a lot of ideas that I take to lab come actually from the patients. So it is always a two-way street. In terms of protocol development, it's really important, especially for larger studies, to involve the patients. I know that, for example, patient organizations in Europe and US, Mary Whitley is sitting here, they have boards where patients actually contribute to the protocol review. So because if you have a protocol that is not practical, you're not going to enroll. So that is actually pharma is better off by involving patients. But also that I would actually go one step further. You cannot improve something that you don't measure. The problem is our patient-reported outcomes often are borrowed from another disease. Like we use HAC. One of the questions is, can you get out of bathtub? In US, nobody has a bathtub anymore. So these are not, like, we need questionnaires that are developed based on the lived experiences of scleroderma patients, not based on lived experiences of a rheumatoid arthritis patients. So if somebody approaches you regarding questionnaire development, please work with them. This is so important, because the only way we can improve patients' experience in a systematic manner is that we measure it better. Yeah. And the last point, I don't think we have discussed this, that I would like to bring up. I have a lot of patients who have already lost 50% lung volume. And each time I give them a drug that is going to just stabilize the disease, they keep asking me, is there anything that would make the fibrosis go away? So it's like an antifibrotic that not only prevents additional fibrosis, that actually makes the existing fibrosis go away. There are some data from cell therapy that shows some volume gain that is encouraging. But my dream would be that we have one day an antifibrotic, I don't know, could be cell therapy or other venues, that will really make the existing fibrosis go away. I think that's a major unmet need. Patients keep asking me that.
Yeah, and of course what we hope is that research ultimately leads to clinical trials, and so you've identified a really important point, which is not just the clinical endpoint, but the endpoints that also matter for patients. But we need to be able to measure those. So, Brian, I'm really keen to know, when it comes to the clinical trials you're doing, do you think about quality of life measures and patient-reported outcomes, and how do you go about trying to include them?
Absolutely. Those are probably very, very important key factors that we always ask the patient community for feedback on, particularly around patient-reported outcomes and patient-relevant endpoints. Because I think, as you know, oftentimes in trials we have clinically relevant outcomes, and those tend to be easier to measure, more objective. But we always look and ask, are these patient-relevant outcomes? Because there's no point in having medicine that's not relevant for patients, that patients are not feeling better from or getting outcomes that they want. And so we always encourage that in our studies. And then with the patients, we always encourage them to speak with their physician as well on shared decision-making and what are the patient's goals for going on either investigational therapy or approved therapies, because all the outcomes from medicine should be relevant for the patient. So there is still a lot of work to be done. But I think, from events like this conference and others, we've heard loud and clear and over the years that things like fatigue are very, very important for patients. Mental health is very important for patients. Many of these outcomes we try to take a look at through patient-reported outcomes. But again, I think some of the outcomes that are important for patients just tend to be a little bit harder to measure, but we're trying to work and trying to get better at how we can do a better job at measuring it and capturing it, and then sharing it with regulatory authorities as well as payers to demonstrate the value that Michael has said.
So, Shervin, what does the current landscape look like for clinical trials for scleroderma patients? And then, importantly, what should patients know when they're considering participation?
It really depends on the clinical trial. I would say systemic sclerosis at this point is one of the hottest clinical trial landscapes that exists in rheumatology. It has, somebody who has been in the field for 20 years, the change is dramatic. So we have, the same way Michael was saying, 10% of patients are member of his organization. We have only a small subgroup of existing patient pool that is getting involved in clinical trials. So it requires a partnership. Please be open in being enrolled in clinical trials, but also please have open discussions about what is the treatment, what is the control arm, does the control arm require me to stop my current treatment or not? Does the therapy require that my current treatment needs to be stopped or not? What are potential side effects of that drug? Has that drug been studied in another disease? What were the side effects and the efficacy of that drug in another disease? So these are really important questions. And again, I think those type of questions are much better answered in a specialized scleroderma center. And I acknowledge that not every patient will have access to a specialized scleroderma center.
So, as you said, there are a lot of clinical trials out there at the moment. And so how do people kind of keep abreast of that? So, Michael, what's your view on the most effective way for patients to stay informed about therapeutic developments?
Well,
come to the conference.
Yeah, short answer, come to the conference. No. The first question is how do patients stay informed? And the second question is how should patients stay informed? Patients have nowadays a lot of possibilities to stay informed. Everyone knows the expression Dr. Google. I think this is meanwhile old-fashioned, because since we have AI, the simple Google platform is just not performing enough. So the better option is, we have seen it, I think, 1 or 2 sessions before about the AI and scleroderma. There are pretty good outcomes with AI, but still you don't know the source. Some AIs give you the source, but my recommendation is click on the link and check the source itself, if it is really a good source. And so this is what patients normally do. What patients should do is get their information from a reliable source, like a conference, for example, or just tell them, ask your doctor. And make sure that your doctor is an experienced scleroderma specialist. So what I wanted to say is that many patients are not involved in a patient association. So we as a patient association have to take care about publishing the insights from this Congress so that everyone has access, not just the members. Because as we figured out, the non-members is the majority. What patient association should do, they should translate from the language of research to the lay language to the patients. And the other way around, they should translate the unmet needs and the voice of the patients towards the research community. So this is what we're doing, and we should keep doing that, and we should expand it. So my opinion is that an essential information is based on an essential communication in between the triangle of patient association, research, and medical community. So to give everyone a reliable source of information and a transparent source, and we should speak the language of the patients when we inform. So this is the task of a patient association.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say that some of you may have noticed that FESCA has recently updated its website so that we've got a more customizable platform, an interactive platform. And one of the things that will be coming very shortly is a plugin which will pull through all the clinical trials that are happening in Europe. The States has already got that for the States, but we will be getting that information pulled through into the website, plus content that maybe picks up on some of the issues we've been discussing today, takes you through what is a clinical trial. We will have videos and animations to help explain it, and they're resources that you can then use in your associations. So we've heard about the science, we've heard about clinical trials, but then what happens when trials are successful and we want those innovations to succeed and the product to come to market? It's really important that we look at this in the round. And I think one of the things that we've been long championing is multi-stakeholder conversation. We need to understand everybody's barriers and challenges, and that includes regulators, because we want to get these products to market. So, Brian, I'm first going to come to you with a question. How do we address the challenge of making high-cost, innovative therapies accessible within healthcare systems? $1 million question.
This is a fantastic question. I know everyone's wondering, because these therapies hopefully have a potential to, again, lead to treatment-free remission and really new research that could be so beneficial for our patients, but come at a high cost because of the complexities in manufacturing and scalability. I think there are a few things. The first is, if we're talking about some of our latest research in cell therapy, hopefully that research will demonstrate good efficacy, good safety, and durability. And I think this is where the conversation needs to pivot. If a cell therapy has strong evidence of durability, then that should be able to help start the discussion with payers and regulators on the value of that medicine. So if a patient is in treatment-free remission for 10 or 20 years, then it demonstrates the value to the healthcare system. And those discussions need to be had with payers, government, regulators. But of course, we can't wait 10 years and say, we'll pay you in 10 years, right? We have to come up with new models, whether it's, if it only lasts 5 years, the company gives some money back, or, different models to understand the value of the medicine. We're in these discussions with policymakers. There's other expensive medications that we can look at their models and how they've been able to come to market and help patients. And then I think further on, Dr. Asasi talked about different types of modalities within cell therapy that actually could be more easily manufactured and a little bit more scalable when we talk about allogeneic platforms, where we get a healthy donor blood and create drug from one healthy donor for hundreds of patients. Much easier to manufacture and scale than the one-to-one cell therapies that we were previously talking about. And then there are also in vivo platforms where the medicine is injected into the patient and the patient's body manufactures the medicine themselves. So there are new platforms coming that will make the manufacturing process much easier, much more scalable, and much more cost-friendly, which will drive down the costs. But of course, this research and these therapies are just a little bit behind the cell therapies that we're seeing in research today. So yeah. I think with new modalities, with competition, with value-based discussions, we should be on track over the next few to several years for better access for innovative medicines for patients.
Shervin, you touched on this earlier. You were kind of saying within the healthcare system there are barriers. So what are those barriers that you see in bringing new treatments into practice?
Obviously, each healthcare system is different, unfortunately. This fragmentation of healthcare system approvals is not good for the patients, is not good for the doctors, not good for pharma, because basically it makes the roadmap for getting approvals so difficult. In US, it's even not nationwide. Like one insurance pays for a drug, the other insurance doesn't. And and it changes over time. 6 months ago, they were paying for it. Now they don't pay. It's a nightmare. If you ask me what is the one aspect that I don't like about my job, is dealing with drug coverage denials, like writing, and I use AI for that too, so for those letters. So it is really, I guess it's the patient advocacy that can say, look, we want these drugs to be covered. We don't want each insurance making its own decision. We want something that is fair, that is based on science, based on patients' lived experiences, and is universal.
Yeah, and I'm going to give the final word to Michael. So, what do you perceive then as the real-world consequences of all this for patients when drugs don't get reimbursed, they don't get access to the market, but the innovation's there and the drug has been proved to be realistic and deliverable?
This creates a very difficult situation for each patient. In my talk this afternoon, I mentioned that in CAR T-cell therapy, for example, not being eligible for a treatment is a huge impact for a patient, and feels like an exclusion from hope and from a better life. So imagine a patient knows that there is a treatment that would be approved and would be promising, but he or she hasn't access to it. Imagine that what a kind of a burden that is. So patients may know that promising treatments exist, but barriers, as Shervin said, reimbursement decisions, or even limited treatment centers, or countries without a medical infrastructure can also be a limit to access. So this can lead to frustration and inequality. And inequality is not what we want to have in medicine and treatment. So from a patient perspective, medical invention becomes meaningful when actually it reaches all the people who need it. And this is what has to be taken into consideration when developing new drugs. So therefore, access and affordability should considered very early in the development of new drugs and new treatments.
Thank you. We've had a number of questions come in, some of which I think we've already covered in our conversation. There are a couple I think we've not particularly, and we've just got a short time left. The one question is, do you feel these new treatments will help people who've been living with SSC for 10 years? Shervin, what's your view?
That's our hope, obviously. That's why we are all gathering, learning new things about molecular profile of treatment, molecular profile of the diseases and what the treatments do. That's why we are designing new clinical trials. That's why you are participating in the clinical trials.
But I think there's often this worry that if you've had the disease for more than 10 years, then it may not be efficacious for you. But you think there's hope for no matter how long you've had the disease?
So again, we are expanding that inclusion-exclusion criteria. And there are now multiple clinical trials that don't have that disease cutoff. Mm-hmm. So I hope those trials are positive, and we can offer those patients something.
Can I add a couple points? I think Dr. Assasi's brought up some very important points. One is that some of these newer trials are starting to accept patients that have had disease for more than 5 years. You've talked a little bit about antifibrotics as well, and I think the current data for our cell therapies do show some direction of, let's say, reversing disease to a certain extent. But I think there's a lot more where we need to understand about the disease, and there's a lot of exciting research. So I'm personally hopeful that over the next 5 to 10 years, we have more data, more research to hopefully help patients who have had disease for much longer.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we've had a really broad conversation, obviously quite broad, not in depth necessarily, but we could be here all day on this topic. I think what I've picked up across this conversation are a number of themes, innovation, personalization, meaningful patient outcomes, and the ongoing challenge of access. And to me, what this highlights is the importance of something we say a lot, which is collaboration across science, industry, clinical care, and the patient community. And that's what we will continue to champion. My final comments, I should say a massive thank you to our speakers here today and to you for your questions. Thank you very much.